One of the biggest problems that faces League of Legends, the competitive esports side of it, is building rivalries and building storylines beyond just teams meeting once or twice, as in like you meet for one game in your regular season here or one small series here that doesn't have as much meaning. You can have the domestic rivalries to a degree as long as the teams are good enough, but as long as we stick with this actual league format for the game and for esports in League of Legends, it's going to really suffer from the inability to build these international rivalries between players and in terms of team matchups, like interesting teams you want to see match up or good players who you really always want to see face off. Within this structure here, unless there's some way to fit international tournaments around it or more regional, interregional tournaments or more mixed tournaments, there's going to be a huge problem in trying to build these stories up, because a lot of what makes a rivalry great is actually the number of times the people have met, but crucially not just that, it's not just frequency, it's the number of times they've met that were significant moments in their careers. Like there's always a myth that I hear propagated, which is that if two players or two teams meet each other too much, then it's not special anymore and it loses the meaning. And people often go to the other total extreme by saying that, oh, it's actually much better. I heard some Riot people suggest something along these lines back before they allowed any international tournaments, and it was just season 3. They tried to suggest someone, I forget who, that it would make it more special if the two teams who met in the final of Worlds or two teams who met only at Worlds hadn't met each other the whole time before. They'd never played each other. And the storyline would be like, oh, this tournament, they'd be building up domestically, they'd be here, then they'd get to this period, and you'd be watching them both from miles away, almost like it was like one of those countdown shows for a boxing match, and then eventually they'd meet at the top and it'd be the best match ever. First of all, it's very likely the one time they meet is going to be really awesome. So by having them meet more times, you've got a way better chance of yielding more really good matches. Even amongst the best teams, you can have stupidly one-sided matchups or matchups that don't make sense until they've played a few times. Secondly, that actually isn't the case. Like, you're not really tracking them like that, and what tends to happen is the ones you had been tracking like that on a collision course, maybe one of them drops you out here, or this it goes in the semi-final, or they get the wrong bracket, or they're in the same group and then they only play each other once or twice and then they never see each other again. There's all these problems that lie in the way. So I'll fully admit there can be situations where playing too much hurts you. Like, I know in StarCraft 2 there have been certain tournaments where they had so many tournaments in a year, like 10, 12 that the same couple of players went to, that if they just met in like the group there, or they met in like the round of 16 a couple of times here, then it might not be as good. But it was never worth giving those up for the awesome times they met in the semi-finals or the final, or they did have an awesome match there. Like, it was worth the price. And crucially, like I say, you're going too far one way or the other there. What you want is for them to meet a bunch of times. So say they meet 3 or 4 times in a year. Now you've got an awesome basis for a great storyline, because it's not just the meaningless times, but it's going to be the important times. And so one of the problems, and I'll give examples to highlight this. Let me just give you an example of that. One of the great examples I think of in history is going to be in Brood War. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to pick an example here that admittedly doesn't fit a lot of the constraints of League of Legends. Like, a lot of the ones I'm going to pick are like international rivalries, etc. Obviously in Korean Brood War, everyone lived in Seoul, everyone played in one league, everyone played the same sort of leagues. But I'm going to point out how the meeting built the story so you can see the mechanism. So Flash and Jaedong were two of the best players ever, and Jaedong had been the best player in 2009, and then in 2010, in regular season type play, team play, Flash was easily the best player, but he was getting to these finals, and he made 4 finals in a row where he was facing Jaedong in all 4 of them. And so the first time he met, Flash gave it his best, and Jaedong just had enough and beat him, and then beat him in a great game, and then just crushed him in the last game, and it was like, I guess he can't beat him. In the next final, he played him, Flash suddenly just smashed him 3-0. And you're like, oh my god, wow, is this how it's going to be every time now? In the next final they played after that, it was a super narrow, full 5 games. And the last sort of 3 are way back and forwards, and then suddenly Flash wins this tense 5th game, and wow, now he's smashed him, and now he's just beat him a really close game. Now you come to the 4th final, and listen, some people were like, it's a foregone conclusion, I guess Flash just wins, whatever. No, now Flash won convincingly, but now you saw, like, you could see in Jaedong's play the desperation of like, well, I've lost the last 2 finals to him, okay, he smashed me that one time, but I'll come back and smash him. Oh no, now I lost this narrow final. And you could see like desperation in this play. And what was beautiful about this was, first of all, the storyline that developed from like Flash can't win to like, oh my god, he won in massive fashion, he just edged that one, what will happen next time, I'm worried, to like, convincing win. You saw the evolution of like, no, he is the better player now. The rivalries developed from where he couldn't beat someone to now he's actually convincingly better, and crucially, you saw it the other way around. Like, if you'd only seen the first final, you'd think, oh, J-Dog's the best player ever, forget this, Flash. If the rivalry had ended there, it'd be massive problems. If the rivalry had ended when Flash had been smashed, you'd be like, oh, well, it was never even close between them. I guess the other one was an anomaly. You see, every single one becomes a chapter in the story that, by having more data and more meetings, tells you more about it. That's another problem with teams meeting too rarely, is that when they meet in like one series, or worse, like one group stage game or two group stage games are separated, or the same problem that we have in LCS in the regular split, it really gives a big problem in trying to draw conclusions, because people draw these crazy conclusions, and yet it's based on a small series. Like, think about this. Based on that last final, not this year, but last year's Season 3 World Championship final, when you watched the final, I could have polled everyone in the world after the final and said, who's the better AD carry out of Uzi and Piglet? Every fucking guy in the world would be like, well, obviously Piglet, because he got like the most kills. He had like this crazy, like, was it a penta or a quadra on Ezreal? His team was dominating, and he was like one of the key factors of it. And crucially, Faker had all the hype, but actually in the final, Faker did some good stuff, but actually it was... The guy getting a lot of the kills in the team fights and the chases and the skirmishes was Piglet. So everyone said, well, obviously it's Piglet. I mean, that's not even close. What are you talking about? Uzi just did some stuff versus the Chinese people and Europeans, but Piglet's the best. Well, what did you think now, a year later after you've seen this? Is there anyone watching this now who's like, oh, I think Piglet's still better? Yeah. Almost no one. They didn't even get to meet, but just knowing more about their careers afterwards started to tell you more about the story. But imagine if Uzi had never qualified for another Worlds. Piglet didn't qualify for another Worlds. You'd be stuck with that old story that's totally inaccurate, and you'd never get to see good matchups of the players you want to see. You need to see Uzi versus other people, versus other great players. You need to have more chapters to the story to make it interesting. These are the most interesting aspects to me, these great rivalries, because it's not just that you're having great games, which is what happens when you get some of the best players play. Like, there's even a great quote from an interview that Flash did. Actually, it was a J-Dog interview where... let me think who it was. Yeah, it was a J-Dong interview way back, and they asked him about the fact he'd met Flash so many times, and he made some sort of cryptic comment, but that was like a really cool way to describe like the why it was so important to meet these same people over and over again, have that challenge of like the guy you can't beat, or the guy you're overcoming, or the guy who used to beat you and now you beat him, and now he's trying to figure out how to get back into the rivalry. He said some comment like that he felt as if him and Flash had actually known each other in a past life, and they'd been friends in a past life, and so as a result in this life they had that connection, that closeness, but in this life they'd been sort of put into the roles of rivals. And the idea was this was a guy who he had like a connection with, or some close thing, and so the story of his life would be that at every key moment in his life he'd have to meet Flash somehow. So early on in his career he met Flash, but actually he beat him a bunch of times there. Then he became the best player. Then for Flash to become the best player, he had to come into J-Dong, beat him, overcome him, better him. And it's like the interplay, not just of the great matches they had all throughout these careers, but the effect that it had and the significance of it being that same guy. If it had been some other guy with a similar skill set, it'd be like, well, okay, there's a totally different guy. That wouldn't have as much meaning, actually. Making it more randomized and just a few matches that don't have any connections, no storylines forming, that's the big problem. In terms of data size being too small, think about how I outlined that storyline there. I'll use another example, but again, I won't use an international one, because to show you how this example works, I have to pick one in a league sense that's going to be domestic, because how else are they going to have played that many times? So imagine if KTB and SKT were international teams who lived in different regions, and imagine instead of the OGN Summer Final of 2013, when they met in that final, that awesome final, the 3-2 win for SKT from 2-0 down, imagine that had been the final of that World Season 3. And so let's say KTB had been Chinese and SKT was Korean. They made it there, they got to the final, and they'd had that same final there. KTB goes up 2 games, there's great strategy, but then SKT's figured it out just enough by the third game. They start to come back. You have that amazing 5th Z game, the ZVZ mirror. Think about what your conclusions would be if those two teams had never met after that only that one final would happen. Now, first of all, it would be an awesome final and there would be 2 great teams. But what's funny is it would actually allow people who were fans of the team who lost, KTB, to say stuff like, well, that was a fluke, like it was just KTB like choking and falling apart that gave SKT that win there. You know, they were up 2-0, they should have closed it out. Like, if they played again, they would definitely beat them. Like, I know for sure they would. This time they wouldn't make the mistakes and they'd go up 2-0 and they'd win. And then, you know what? Maybe actually, I mean, Rio only got outclassed in the ZVZ mirror, so maybe if he just hadn't picked Zed, then he would have beaten this Faker guy in a best of 5 and he would have been better. all these conclusions I've picked now would be reasonable to a degree, and yet think how ridiculous they sound now because you know what happened since. Like, what's great is right after that final, like the next week or something, you had the regional final where KTB played SKT again. SKT beat them 3-1 in a best of 5. Then that winter, they played in the semi-finals. SKT beat them 3-0. And even when KTB was having these games, like Game 3, where it was super close and they were really in the series, SKT always had enough to beat them. And crucially, Faker was always better than Ryu. And it's like that all those questions before didn't exist now. We had awesome matchups. And by the way, the anticipation was wonderful every time because we knew these were like true finals and true great meetings. And if KTB had ever won one of those, what extra significance it would have had for their careers. It would have been fucking amazing. In terms of like sporting examples, I'll show you how in sports, actually, the storyline is what makes it great. There's never the problem of them having met too many times, as long as you can interpret the story correctly. Like, for example, Federer versus Nadal, probably the two greatest players of the modern era. They've got all these Grand Slam titles between them. If you actually look at their overall record, it's actually really skewed in favour of Nadal. Like, off the top of my head, I think it's something ridiculous. Like, I think he's won like, let's say like 29 times and Federer's won like 11 or something, you know. So it's actually really skewed in favour of Nadal, even though Federer's considered the greater player. So as a result, you'd think to yourself, well, that'd be boring then, because if you play, you know Nadal's just going to win. No, because if you look at the way the games play out, that's what makes it amazing. Because every time they play a game, when they're both at their best, Federer will play these amazing points and he'll play some of the best games he's ever played in his whole career. And he'll get pushed to a new level he doesn't have to go to with certain other players. And he'll make all these shots. And you can even see him understanding the context of the past meetings. Like, he's taking more aggressive shots here. And he's not going to play more defensive on this shot. He knows he has to go for this really difficult shot here to try and beat Nadal, because Nadal's so good at returning the ball that as a result, when Nadal then wins whatever the rate is, like 3 out of every 4 of these matches or 2 out of every 3, it actually means that it has more significance, and all the past matches are building into a story of context that makes it even more crazy what is already a great match that you're seeing now. So and by the way, if then Federer wins some of these matches, you go, wow, I know the incredible significance of that. He almost never beats him on clay, and like, whoa, he was able to like shut down that aspect of the game that he's had so many problems with. Meanwhile, if Nadal wins the otherwise, you're like, we've played him that many times, he's playing the best player ever, and the best player ever can't figure him out. He's still able to sort of come through with heart and determination and make that grinding style work, and what athleticism. It just makes the story better and better and better, and this is what's made it so that even when they meet now in tournaments, it's still amazing. It's better to some degree because of that storybook. Whereas if they had just met once in like a League of Legends sense, so let's say they'd met once in like a French Open final, which is Nadal's best surface, and Nadal just wrecks him like he did in a bunch of those French Open finals, and then you'd be like, oh, I guess Nadal is just like way better than Federer, and like no point in them playing again, would just be boring. Like, well, that's not at all accurate in any possible sense. So that's like a team level. And you can see the problem here, because if you go back to the old model, I'm sure anyone watching this from League of Legends knows I'm a proponent, I'm a fan of the old style of having a tournament circuit where you have maybe like 5 or 6 domestic tournaments, you have like 3 or 4 big international tournaments, and the idea is it's up to the teams what they want to attend or they qualify into them, and the idea is you've got way more chance for these cool matchups. Like M5 can play TPA more than just once, so if they'd have only met in the semi-finals of Season 2 Worlds, then everyone, all of M5 fans, as they do, would be like, oh, we'd have definitely won that if it'd been best of 5. It's true to a degree, but then the problem is they met IPL 5 not long after, and TPA beat them a few times, so that helps at least make it more legit TPA's win, instead of just being cited forever as like, fluke, just a fluke that win. Same with CLGEU. They almost won OGN. They could be citing that forever, but luckily, semi-finals of Worlds, they met Frost there. Frost beat them 2-1. It's like, okay, maybe Frost was the better team. Like, these storylines made the matches better, made them more hype, but also in a legitimate way, because it was building into a storyline we now have another chapter of. Obviously, I prefer that model. So in that model, it's much easier to get matches with key players you like, and crucially, of top teams that you enjoy. And so as a result, you've seen Doublelift versus CLGEU versus M5. You've seen him versus all these teams. You've seen some of the European Froggen versus whoever you want. He actually played tons of people. ManCloud, Reginald, Big Fat LP. Played them all in Season 2. The problem is, in Season 3 and Season 4, and now going to Season 5, we've had all these matchups that a lot of us have been dying to see, and we not only have never seen them, some of them we will now never see, and some of them it's quite unlikely we'll ever see, even though they're following nearly all the rules we need. So I'll give you a few of them, okay? One of the worst ever that we never got to see was Double Lift versus Wei Zhao, the two AD carries. At the end of Season 2, these two were the two best AD carries par excellence. Like, people are going to say Prey, and yeah, Prey was a very good player, but not that sort of dominate the whole game. Has to carry everything, total focal point, because he had Macnoon on his team, obviously. That's really what these two players were. And the only time we ever got to see them play was in a fucking all-star match, which, by the way, doesn't really count as like proper competition because it's a team game. You don't have your teams. You don't have proper teams built around you that have the approach and strategy you want. It's just a fucking... It may as well have been like... That's like saying, oh, well, at least Larry Bird did play Michael Jordan when one was playing for the Harlem Globetrotters versus the Washington Giants. No, that would be fucking garbage, wouldn't it? That wouldn't be the same as them meeting in like the playoffs 2 years in a row in the NBA. Wouldn't be the same. Likewise, let's look at another one. One that's a tragedy that we haven't had is Froggen versus Bjergsen in a proper best-of-5 series. In Europe, one was like the established great, one was like the up-and-coming guy, never on the same side of the bracket to play that one time they were there. Then they go into other regions. Now, even when they're amongst the best teams in their region, there's no way for them to meet. There's not really any international competitions that have them meeting in that sense. For Worlds, they both get to Worlds. Sorry guys, wrong groups, and then the way the brackets play out, you're always just going to run in straight into some Koreans and you get wrecked anywhere. In fact, they could have only met, almost, if they'd have both, let me think what could have happened. Well, actually, I guess it could have gone both ways. But anyway, they could have been on the same side of the bracket, but they'd have both had to beat a fucking Samsung team to meet in the semi-finals. That was never going to happen. Now, admittedly, we did have one chance at this IEM recently, San Jose, where they could have met in the final, but obviously Unicorns of Love fucked that up. Cloud9 won a close series, so that didn't happen. But we've never got to see these two players play. Then you take both of them. Everyone's wanted to see Bjergsen or Froggen versus Faker. All great players, all to some degree in their prime still. We're never going to get to see him because of this weird system of how their teams have to go through this filter that hardly any teams are going to get through and meet somehow in some fortuitous manner. When Flame was one of the best players, under the Riot system, we'd have never seen him play versus international competition. Now, we did, luckily, because he went to IPL 5, he went to IM Katowice, he went to IM World Championship, all at the end of the Season 2 period, going into Season 3, where there were still some international tournaments, and that's why we've seen him versus Darien, versus Wicked. Have we seen him versus Wicked? Yeah, I think we did. I think it was the World Championship might have pillared him. All these teams who you want to see them play against. Think about even modern day examples. So Uzi and Deft, two of the best AD carries in the world, never played each other. Never played in a single series in international competition, and yet they're both really awesome. Both got to at least the semi-finals of Worlds, so they both fulfilled a lot of the qualifications. Qualify from your country, get deep in the tournament. No, sorry, you can't meet. You're wrong side of the bracket. Unfortunately, you'll maybe now never meet in your whole careers, except for the fact, obviously, they're both in China now. Name versus Deft. Similar styles of play, similar use within their teams. Wrong side of the bracket would have had to meet in the final, or you would have needed... or EDG would have needed to beat Samsung White enough times to get first in their group. Then they could have met in the semi-final. So, no big deal there. Just be the most dominant team of all time in one tournament span. You can get to the semi. Ridiculous. Let's think of even some more Western examples. How about Reckless? Wouldn't you love to see Reckless versus Imp? That aggression, that delay and dominance. How would Reckless hold up against it? Reckless versus Uzi. Uzi going to contest every CS, going to bully. What would Reckless do? You'll never get to know. That will probably never happen as a matchup. The big problem right now, I get that why Riot and why other people want to do the league format. The problem is the league format throws up problems, and in this particular case, this is one of the biggest problems because to me it takes away a lot of the interest of what can be great about sports and about esports, crucially. And so I'm not sure what the solution is aside from add more international tournaments, limit league play a little bit, add in more tournaments where maybe it's optional to attend, or more tournaments where the top teams play each other, but in a mixed format, you play more games, you don't just have to get through this crazy bracket, because that's the problem at the moment, the filter's too extreme. Let's think about how two great players have to meet. So I'll pick one of those examples we had there. So we'll take Reckless versus Imp, because actually both of these players potentially could meet again at Season 5, so I'll give you how they'd have to meet. So Reckless plays for Alliance, who look like at least one of the top 3 teams in Europe, which is what you need to be to qualify for Worlds. Imp plays for LGD, who look like one of the top 2 or 3 teams in China, which is what you need to qualify for Worlds. So let's imagine they're going to meet at Worlds. What we need to happen now is both have to still be in top 3 teams. Oh, sorry, it's the beginning of the season, so they can be great on the spring split, but if everything falls apart summer, game over. They need to be great on the spring split, but then they have to be good enough still in top 3 teams by the summer split that they can qualify for Worlds. Now, when they get to Worlds, you've got two ways it can go. Either they get placed in the same group, great, they get to play each other, don't they? Yeah, but just in two best of ones. Like that, who gives a fuck? We want to see a best of five to see how the matchup would develop over the best of five. We don't want to see one have a great game first and like, oh, he's better. Well, no, there might still be 3-4 games left to play if we play a best of five now. What if one beats 1-2 in a row and you're like, oh, yeah, he's getting the better of him, but then the other one comes back and he dominates and he owns him. This is what you want to see. You want to see the way this develops. I mean, imagine if Doublelift had only played Pinoy in one game in a group stage in that what happened in the IEM final recently where Gambit played against CLG and Doublelift had gone 0-8 or whatever, and if everyone went, he's trash and Pinoy is way better. Well, no, we had to see the rest of the series develop, and actually, even though Doublelift lost, he gave it quite a good accounting for himself and see, I could see actually with more data how this story really worked out. So okay, they get to this scenario, they're in Worlds. Now let's imagine they're in separate groups. Now, odds are, if they have a fucking Korean in their group, since there's going to be 3 Koreans spread out over the groups, they're not going to come out in first each. So the bracket could very well end up that they just both go off, play Koreans, like Samsung Blue versus like TSM and C9, and then just get their heads kicked in, and then they could never meet. Or one of them has to massively upset a Korean. Let's say one does it, but how's the other one going to do that as well? Or one's going to meet a Chinese team that they're going to beat. The actual odds of getting these matchups, like the Froggen versus Bjergs, etc., unless we have specific NA versus EU, or we have just more dotted out tournaments and we have more built in, more chances. We're not saying you're going to rig it and set it up, but you have to give chances for it to happen. At the moment, there aren't enough chances. All the chances are too extreme. Like, it's like fucking an insane parlay of this has to happen into this has to happen. And if one thing goes wrong, the whole thing's fucked. But if this happened down, then this happens. Then over here, you need this to happen as well. And then this also has to happen. And if this doesn't, it's all over. The 49th out of 50 things didn't happen, so the whole thing's fucked. You need to have a better system in this respect. And I don't know the solution, because I know my solution is go back to the old thing. So I have some ideas, but I think this is something that has to be looked at, because it's going to be it's going to really spoil some aspects of league play if Froggen's doing really well in Europe and Bjergsen's doing really well in NA, and you never get to see them properly meet. And it's going to suck if you never get to see Name versus Deft when they have these similar styles, and how would they match with different teams? One as a Korean team, one as listen, in that case, I'm giving the old example where they were in Korea and China, obviously. Reckless versus Imp or Uzi. These are matchups we want to see. We want to see what happens in them. We want to see how the story could develop, what rivalry could be there. And at the moment, we're sort of getting screwed a bit. And as a result, because we just have these one big tournament or whatever, it feels a bit arbitrary, some of the matchups. Like, who is going to look back in time and go, Samsung Blue versus C9, what a great rivalry that was. Well, that team is split up now. They'll never play again. Now, there's no rivalry to build off that. There's no storyline to build off that whatsoever. Or Najim White Sword versus White Shield versus OMG, that'll be one for the ages. Not really. Teams broken up. No chance for that again. Doesn't matter how good any of these teams are, and even worse, obviously, if you're a player like Fakey, you can be a god in your region, but because you didn't fit through that narrow thing, you don't get to even start any stories in the next year. You don't get to continue anything from Season 3 Worlds. The filters are too extreme.